Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to those of us joining from Moscow and European Russia. Good day to those joining from the United States. And a hearty good morning to any hardy souls joining us from the Russian Far East. My name is Lou Krishak, and I'm the Consul General of the United States in Vladivostok. And I'm here for a presentation entitled Comedy in American Life. Now, that's an awfully broad topic, comedy in American life. Comedy is many things. First of all, it's an art form. It's a genre, a type of presentation, performance, show, television show, or movie. Comedy is also a multi-billion-dollar business. It's a lot more than anyone could hope to cover in just an hour. And I'm not really going to try and cover it encyclopedically. We're going to cover just a few things. So if we go to the first slide. All right, our title, Comedy in American Life. We go to the second slide, we'll talk about our goals for today's presentation. So next slide, please. Thank you. All right, today I'd like to focus on just a few moments, places where comedy has helped to shape American culture, and American culture and American life has helped to shape comedy. I'd like to introduce you to some technology, new technology and old technology. From the 50s, the advent of television and modern entertainment in the United States up until the present. Pieces of technology that help to make comedy what it is today. I hope that throughout this presentation, you will see how diversity in the United States has impacted American comedy, making it what it is today. I'm definitely going to leave plenty of time for questions and answers, so feel free to use the chat function on Facebook or Zoom to submit your questions. I'm also going to make this an interactive presentation, at least at one point. There'll be a trivia question, and you can use the comment function or the chat function for your answers for that. I look forward to showing just a few places where Russian and American comedy has intersected, and to give you just a couple examples of colloquial English usage related to comedy. Now, if I want to do a presentation on the role of comedy in American life, starting with the advent of television to the present, there's really only one place to start, and that's with the alpha innovators of show business in the United States, Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz. Slide, please. No story on comedy or entertainment in the United States would be complete without telling the story of Lucy and Desi, the queen of American comedy and her Cuban-American immigrant band leader husband. Together, Lucy and Desi created I Love Lucy, a situation comedy of the 1950s that adapted their vaudeville show into a television sitcom that debuted in the 1950s and could be seen in reruns well into the 1980s and 1990s. It's a show I grew up on, and a lot of middle-aged Americans will have seen all of the episodes of it, some of them many times. More importantly, Desi and Lucy revolutionized how television was made in the United States. When I Love Lucy began, television was often broadcast live, performed as it were as a stage show, and then shown to viewers. Many companies didn't even think it was worth taping. They asked themselves, who would want to watch this a second time? If tapes were made at all, they were taped live from the air and were of particularly low quality. Many of the first shows were simply lost to posterity. When Lucy and Desi went to CBS to begin to shoot I Love Lucy, they told the CBS network they wanted to shoot it like a movie, on film using multiple cameras. When CBS responded that that would be expensive, Lucy and Desi said, we'll cover the cost. That's fine. Moreover, they said, we'll produce the show ourselves. And they formed a studio, Desilu Pictures, which they named after themselves. And they said Desilu, the company, would own the film of the show thereafter. It's this innovation, this bit of business technology, if you were, that made syndication, what's sometimes called reruns, possible. And it turned situation comedies and entertainment TV in general into a multi-billion-dollar business. One show alone, the sitcom Seinfeld, is thought by entertainment experts to have generated $3 billion in revenue in syndication alone. Now, if Desilu Studios is known primarily for I Love Lucy, and let's face it, it is, it's important to note they went on to shoot other important television shows, very important works for the history of American entertainment. You may or may not know that the most famous sci-fi program of all time, Star Trek, was also filmed by Desilu Studios. In 1969, Lucy, who won the full rights to Desilu Productions after her divorce from Desi Arnaz, Lucy sold Desilu to Paramount Pictures, and it became Paramount Pictures Television. At the time, she sold it for $17 million, and that would be roughly $130 million in today's money. Okay, let's move now from the 50s, though, into the 60s, if we're going to cover the whole sweep in this 1 hour. And we'll talk about another form of technology and its impact on comedy, the LP, the album. Now, you would be correct if you protested at this point and said, wait a minute, vinyl had been used to record many things, music, comedy, lots of other stuff, long, long, long before the 60s, and you'd be right. For decades, up to that point, records had given stand-up comics a chance to supplement their often meager income from touring, from doing shows in comedy clubs and bars, and to gain exposure by selling records. It was in the 1960s, though, that this changed, perhaps less in quality than in degree. In the 1960s, comedy records began to give stand-ups nationwide exposure that they really hadn't received before, turning them into legitimate Hollywood stars and giving them chances to make television shows of their own and movies as well. Just one of the comics that you see on the screen right now, Flip Wilson, the African-American comic, parlayed the success of his 1969 album, The Devil Made Me Buy This Dress, into the starring role of the variety show that bore his name. We look at the other pictures on the screen and we see some other important comics of the 1960s. Lenny Bruce, Joan Rivers, Phyllis Diller, and Bob Newhart. I'd like to focus on Bob Newhart just for a moment to give you an idea of just how important the comedy LP was in American entertainment in the 1960s. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, please. All right. Sometimes, even to this very day, Bob Newhart is referred to by the title of this album, The Man with the Button-Down Mind. The Button-Down Mind of Bob Newhart was released in 1960. It topped the Billboard charts for 14 weeks and stayed on those charts for a full 2 years. Now, to be clear, we're talking about popular records in general, right? He didn't top the comedy charts or the spoken word charts. He topped the charts for 14 weeks. His album was the most popular album in the United States. It sold 600,000 copies, and it won 2 Grammy Awards for Bob Newhart. Best New Artist, and album of the year. No comedian has ever done this. And to put this in perspective, the 14 weeks that Bob Newhart's Button Down Mind album stayed at the top of the charts was just 1 week less than the 15 weeks that the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band stayed at the top of the charts just a few weeks later. Bob Newhart continued to do stand-up, but in the 1970s and 80s, he moved to television, where he created some of America's best-loved sitcoms, including The Bob Newhart Show and Newhart. Let's go to the next slide and take a little break, though, from our tour through history, and we'll talk a little bit about colloquial English as it in a comedy context, as it's related to comedy. The first, the verb to kill. Now, the verb to kill has a positive negative connotation, an extremely powerful, negative connotation, not positive at all. But when used to refer to stand-up, it is only positive, right? I'm a man of peace. I don't want to kill anyone. I'd love to kill on stage, just once in my life. A comic who's performed a show to roars of laughter can be said to have killed on stage. An example of this verb in a sentence might be, did you see Sarah Silverman on The Tonight Show? She killed out there. Now, if to kill and to die are two sides of the same coin, in comedy slang, they're exact opposites. To perform a stand-up act that is so bad that the crowd becomes completely silent, or even worse, starts to boo you or heckle you or throw small change at you, is to die on stage. Did you see Gilbert Gottfried? He died out there, right? There's another word for performing a very, very bad set. You can say someone bombed, right? He bombed. That's something you can use for other entertainment genres as well. You can say a movie or a book bombed too. But to die is almost always reserved to a comedian performing on stage. Really, really bad stand-up. Lastly, knock 'em dead. Again, with this death, you know. Someone said a famous comedian's last words were, dying is easy, comedy is hard. So we're talking about death here a lot for some reason. Anyway, knock 'em dead is an expression that you can use to wish someone luck, perhaps in a comedy context before they go on stage, but not necessarily. You could also use it before something that's much more serious, like an exam or a job interview. Sometimes to stage performers, you don't want to wish them luck. You'll say break a leg. But you can certainly say knock 'em dead. That is another colloquial expression which you might use in this context. All right, let's go to the next slide. Now, those of you who've studied the United States, who know a little bit about the States, will certainly remember that the 1960s were an extremely tumultuous time in my country. It was a time when young people demonstrated in the streets for African American civil rights, for women's rights, women's liberation, for the rights of gay people, and against America's participation in the Vietnam War. It was the era, the 60s were the era that gave us terms like flower power and the hippie movement that last in our vocabulary to this very day. Now, as we moved into the 70s, American society continued to process these changes and these movements and advance them, pushing for more rights and more liberation. In its own way, comedy helped American society to process these changes and to discuss them. Shows like Maude, which you see in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, and the Mary Tyler Moore Show, not on the screen, highlighted independent women having their own views. Whereas in the 50s, many female characters related to male leads, right, as wives or girlfriends, love interests. In the 70s, women were lead characters in their own right. They had their own opinions, their own jobs, and their own lives, and men may or may not have been heavily involved in the stories. Shows like All in the Family, you'll see on the far left, demonstrated the generation gap that existed in American society between conservative parents and their liberated activist children. MASH, which stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, was ostensibly about the Korean War, but in its own way, it gave Americans a way to process the Vietnam conflict and our participation in it. Finally, Soap, which was a spoof, a send-up of American soap operas, was historic in that it introduced the first gay character in a US television series, Jody Dallas, who was played by comedy great Billy Crystal, who later appeared on Saturday Night Live and in many, many movies. Let's move to the next slide. All right. Now, did any of you ever have a box like this on your television? I know I did. I guess I'm dating myself here, but, well, I started out by talking about I Love Lucy, so I guess dating myself was never really an issue. That's a cable television box, one of the first. Cable TV really came to the fore in the 80s. And just like records and their effect on comedy in the 60s, it was revolutionary. Again, like records, cable had been around long before the 1980s. It had been around for decades, since the 50s for sure. But cable TV in the 80s moved from existing in the television world to dominating the television world and changing it, and comedy with it, forever. You can see from that box on the screen, there were 12 buttons and a little channel selector, so you actually had 36 options. Cable meant there were more channels. A regular television might only have 5 or 6 channels that you could access. More channel options meant more specific options. Channels that could present comedy and comedy alone, like Comedy Central or Ha, the Comedy Channel. They were able to broadcast comedy 24 hours a day, exposing Americans to classic situation comedies in syndication or in reruns, as we say. And more importantly, perhaps, allowing stand-up comics and their videotaped presentations from clubs to be cut into 3 or 4 minute chunks, not unlike music videos on MTV, another child of the cable TV era. This exposure, like the record albums of the 1960s, allowed stand-ups to earn money and gain additional nationwide exposure. I remember watching an impression done by the African-American comic Dave Chappelle in exactly this format, a 2-minute bit on a comedy program on the Comedy Channel on cable television. It was an impression of a Domino's pizza delivery man delivering in Washington, D.C. It's probably still on YouTube, and it's extremely funny. If you want to see a 19-year-old Dave Chappelle, you can look it up for yourself. Now, I promised at the very beginning to talk at least a little bit about how the Russian and American worlds of comedy intersect. And let's do that right now. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there's an expression in English that imitation is the greatest form of flattery. And if reruns are one way that a television show can make money, licensing is another. When a show is licensed, its producers make it available to the actors and writers in a foreign country to develop a version of that program for their audience, catered to their audience, interpreting it, if you will, for a different society, a different people, and in a different language. Some of the most successful sitcoms in history have been foreign adaptations of comedy programs. We talked about All in the Family in a previous slide. Well, All in the Family, although it's one of the most important sitcoms in American history, itself was inspired by a British television program called Till Death Do Us Part. Few programs have been licensed more often or more successfully than British comics Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant's The Office, which has spawned editions in the United States, Israel, and at least 6 other countries. Now, okay, guys, this is the point at which we're going to have a little bit of interaction in today's presentation, because I have 4 pictures of American shows that have been adapted for Russian audiences. And I'd ask you to use the chat function to offer your guesses as to what the titles of the Russian versions of these American shows might be. Some are easy, some are a little bit more difficult, but let's go. Let's see how we do. All right. From left to right, we start with Married with Children, The Nanny, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, and last but certainly not least, Everybody Loves Raymond. So take a minute, and if you think you know the Russian version, the Russian adaptation of one of these programs, why don't you enter it into the chat box right now? And while you do that, I'll simply say that when shows move from one culture to another and one language to another, it offers a wonderful opportunity for foreign language learners, an opportunity that I was able to take advantage of when recently polishing my Russian in Washington, D.C. I used one of the programs, which we'll talk about in a second, watching the Russian version because I had watched the American version years before. All right, I see your answers, your correct answers flying in. That's fantastic. Congratulations. That's wonderful. All right, let's go to the next slide and reveal the winners. See what the Russian versions are. We'll go to the next slide, please. All right, that's right. Married with Children became Счастливы вместе. The Nanny, kind of easy, Моя прекрасная няня. Ivan Urgant himself has noted that his widely successful Russian chat show, Вечерний Ургант, which is fantastic, by the way, has sampled bits from The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. He even had Colbert on as a guest, did some wonderful bits with him. You can find that on YouTube too. They have a wonderful channel, Вечерний Ургант. And finally, Everybody Loves Raymond, which was the story of the Barone family that lived right outside New York City in the United States, was rendered by Russia's STS channel as Voroniny, the Voronin family. And Voroniny holds the Guinness Book of World Records record for most prolific foreign adaptation of a sitcom. Sad to say that Everybody Loves Raymond in the United States was cut short because one of the main characters became quite ill and passed away. That, of course, has never happened here, and the Voronin family, Voroniny, has successfully made all of the Raymond scripts into Russian scripts, and they were doing so well when they finished with the Raymond scripts, they started writing scripts of their own. And they've taken the show on plot twists for an additional 10 seasons at least, I believe. Fantastic, fantastic comedy, and one which at the end, if you're interested, we can talk about how you can use shows like that to help to practice English. But right now, let's go to a little bit more serious, but still kind of funny topic, comedy and politics. Let's move to the next slide. One element of comedy life in America that spans generations is humor and politics, comedy and politics. Sometimes here we're talking about satire, where comedians use irony or exaggeration to point out what they see as errors or weaknesses in current policies or politicians. Another interaction of the comedy and political worlds is quite different, and it's the use of humor, including appearances on comedy programs, to make candidates for political office in the United States seem likable and approachable. Now, on the screen, I've put up just a few examples of shows that had satire or political humor as important elements of their regular broadcast. You start at the upper left with Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, and we'll return to that. Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In did a lot of skit comedy, a lot of rather silly jokes. They were also a variety show. They had musical acts, and they did bits, they did skits. Saturday Night Live, I don't want to say not unlike Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, had some similar elements. Saturday Night Live, which has been an incredibly popular show in the United States. It's run for more than 45 years. It has included musical acts and skits and stand-up, and has had political humor, satire, as an important part of its programs from the very beginning. Saturday Night Live has done impressions of every US president from Gerald Ford in 1975 all the way to President Trump today, and without missing a single president in between. We've had presidential candidates appear on Saturday Night Live as guest hosts, again, in an attempt to gain exposure, show themselves as likable, and show American society that they were capable of laughing at themselves. This is something that we like in people that run for office in the United States. Another type of comedy show that has included political humor and satire is a late night chat show. Shows like The Tonight Show, Late Night with David Letterman, The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, often include political humor in their opening monologue segments, and sometimes include politicians as guests. You see a title page for Chappelle's show, which was very popular in the United States in the 1990s. And Chappelle's show did some quite biting satire, including a skit entitled How History Would Look If President Bush, George W. Bush, had been black. Quite biting, but quite funny, quite interesting. It's also available on YouTube. Lastly, The Daily Show has revolutionized satire in America. It's a 30-minute program that combines satirical news bits with serious, if lighthearted, interviews of politicians, artists, and activists. Now, we go to the next slide. We'll talk about one particular example of the intersection of the worlds of politics and comedy. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, and this is the 1968 election. One of the oldest examples I can think of a presidential candidate choosing to poke fun at himself in support of his campaign was when then candidate Richard Nixon, former vice president of the United States, appeared on Laugh-In during the 1968 campaign and quoted the show's famous catchphrase, "Sock it to me." His delivery was quite interesting, let's say. He asked it as a question, "Sock it to me?" Some folks criticized Rowan and Martin for letting the very conservative Nixon appear on their show. They felt that the appearance enabled Nixon to soften his image, to reach more voters, and felt that it may have actually tipped the 1968 election in Nixon's favor. I'm not so sure about that. I think he probably would have won that three-way race anyway, but we may never know. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the intersection of comedy and politics in Russia. I don't have to tell you, satire is well known to Russian audiences and has been for centuries, since the days of the empire. Griboyedov, the Soviet satirists, Ilfin Petrov, Divnatsy Struyev, and Одноэтажная America fame are all well known around the world, and independent Russian television, television in independent Russia, I should say, gave rise to a local version of the UK's satirical puppet show Spitting Image, which here was called Kukli. Now let's go on then to the next slide, if we will. We'll go back to the chronological and technological approach to treating the topic. So we'll go to the next slide, please. All right. So the 90s and beyond, technology continues to change comedy. Not unlike the technological advances of the past, the internet is changing the art form today, and at the same time remaking the business of comedy. Through websites like YouTube, through apps like TikTok, amateur comic artists can produce and distribute their own content, bypassing networks and producers altogether, making filming comedy a lot cheaper and going directly to their audiences. Further, I would say democratizing the medium. Moreover, professional comedians have created their own websites like Funny or Die and College Humor as another way to bypass producers and networks and go straight to viewers. Finally, the advent of high-speed internet has made streaming services like Amazon, Hulu, and Netflix, just to name a few, into combination distributors of content and producers of content. As you can probably tell from my presentation, I'm a fan of the older stuff, classic programs, but I don't want to come off as so old-fashioned that I can't admit that streaming services today have produced some really fine content. Just one example of this, both a funny show in its own right and a show about the history of comedy in the United States, is Amazon's The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel's first season included Lenny Bruce as a character and refers to the Bob Newhart hit record that we discussed earlier in the presentation. All right, so let's move to the next slide, which you might call my Mount Rushmore of American comedy. This is my final slide, and we'll begin a question and answer, an interactive presentation right now. But first, I'll just go through some of these comedians who I think really have shaped comedy in my lifetime and sort of made it what it is today. From the upper left-hand corner, we have Richard Pryor, an incredibly funny stand-up who acted in many, many funny movies. He collaborated with the gentleman right next to him, Mel Brooks, on a number of projects, including the famous send-up of Western movies called Blazing Saddles. They also worked together on History of the World. Next to Mel Brooks is Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy almost single-handedly saved Saturday Night Live. He came as a young comedian to the cast in the 80s when the cast didn't have a lot going on, and Eddie, through his characters, made the show successful again and enabled it to continue producing, to stay on the air, enabling it to make it to this run of over 45 years. Robin Williams is right next to Eddie Murphy, and Robin Williams has a connection to Richard Pryor. Robin Williams was a writer for Richard Pryor back in the 1970s when Richard Pryor had his own show on NBC. Robin Williams was a tremendous stand-up. God rest his soul. He passed a few years ago. An amazing comic actor, an amazing stand-up, simply one of the funniest people I have ever seen perform. A tremendous comedian. Next to him is one of the leading lights of women comics of the 70s and 80s, Gilda Radner. She was also on Saturday Night Live, part of the original cast, the Not Ready for Primetime Players. Next to Gilda, we have Mr. Warmth, Don Rickles. In the second row, we have Rodney Dangerfield, who was an innovator. Very interesting story. Rodney was a stand-up primarily, did some very funny movies, but also when tragedy struck his family and he had to raise two children on his own, he decided to found a comedy club, which he named after himself, Dangerfield's in New York City. They're still in operation today. And a lot of young comics got a start in Dangerfield's in New York City. And they will tell you that Dangerfield's was one of the best clubs they ever performed in, and it paid them a living wage. It enabled them to become professional comedians and to hone their craft. Next to Rodney, you see two young African-American comedians who simply took the United States by storm. Kian Peele, with the show named after them. They did some incredible political satire as well. The previous president of the United States, President Obama, was well known for being quite calm. His public persona was quite calm, still so to this day. And they did a very funny skit called Luther, President Obama's Anger Translator, guessing what he might be thinking when he was very calmly answering questions from the Oval Office. Next to them, you see one of the truly seminal stand-ups of American comedy history, George Carlin. Did a routine called the 7 words you can't say on television. You can't say them on the AMC website either, and I'm not going to. Next to George Carlin is Lily Tomlin. Lily Tomlin was part of the ensemble cast of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. An incredibly funny lady. She acted in the comedy movie 9 to 5. She's acted in dramatic roles as well. Jonathan Winters is next to Lily Tomlin. And Jonathan Winters actually played Robin Williams' child in Williams's sitcom Mork and Mindy. And finally, next to them, we have Jerry Seinfeld. Jerry Seinfeld, who made the show about nothing that made $3 billion in syndication. All right, so with my, that's a lot of faces for a Mount Rushmore, but I just wanted to talk about some truly great comedians that we didn't talk about during the presentation. Now let's go to questions you might have. Forgive Grandpa as he goes to the chat box here. All right. Oh, okay, very good. Okay, who are the 5 best stand-ups working in the industry at present? Wow, that is a tough one, and it's tough because it's always going to be a personal opinion. Some of the old comedians are still doing sets, and I think they're still quite funny. Jerry Seinfeld still does sets from time to time. I think he's an incredibly talented comedian. Ronnie Chang is a young comedian from Malaysia who's performing in the United States, who is really, really funny. A lot of his stuff has captured my attention in recent days. Eliza Schlesinger is a young comedian who's doing some great work. I wouldn't say she's necessarily one of the top 5 in the United States, but she's someone whose work that I like a whole lot. Key and Peele are more into comic acting these days and less into stand-up, but I think that they are going to shape not just the comedy genre, but entertainment in the United States in the years to come. Jordan Peele has moved behind the camera. He's doing producing now. They're just geniuses, and I like their work a whole lot. They're quite funny. Second question we have from Vasily. What is my favorite joke? A one-liner. Stand-up comedians, a comedy show. Wow. Just one. This is sort of like going to a donut shop and having to choose, right? When you have a whole 30, 40 of them in front of you. And it is important to take just one. My favorite joke of all time is probably this one. A priest, a minister, and a rabbi walk into a bar, and the bartender looks at them and says, "What is this, some kind of joke?" There's another one, which is about a joke about comedy, if you will. And I'll tell you that one too. A guy stops a man in Manhattan and says, "How do I get to Carnegie Hall?" Carnegie Hall is a performance venue. And the guy looks at him, looks very seriously at him and says, "Practice, practice, practice." In terms of my favorite comedy show of all time, wow. That's like saying which one of your children is your favorite. I like old SNL. I love me some Rowan Martin's Laugh-In. Kind of hard to choose between the two of them. Chappelle Show I can watch over and over and over again. In terms of sitcoms, Raymond is quite good. Might not be the best of all time. Ray Romano is a great stand-up as well. All right. Thank you, Vasily. That was a great question. A lot of good questions here. Was it hard to understand Russian humor when I first came to Russia? What are the hardest types of comedy to understand? Boy, oh boy, oh boy. Yes, 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 yes. It was hard. Why was it hard? Because when I came to Russia the first time, I didn't speak Russian. I spoke very, very little Russian, just a few words. And so most of the laughter in my life at that point was laughter of folks when I told them, one of the first lines I learned in Russian was to answer questions from passersby when they would ask me for directions or actually, I'm not sure what they were asking me. I suppose they were asking me directions. Maybe they asked me how I was doing. I learned how to say, "Извините, пожалуйста, я не говорю по-русски." And then they would begin to laugh. And I would begin to laugh because it was quite funny. Because I was living in the Urals in 1995 and I really didn't speak much Russian. So that was quite funny. Now, very quickly, I learned I wanted to know Russian better because I wanted to know about Russian comedy. One of my first introductions was the TV program KVN, which back in the mid-90s was hot, hot, hot. I watched that show even when I was studying Russian, even when I didn't get most of the jokes. I watched it, having seen Saturday Night Live, having watched Rowan and Martin. I watched that program and I said, I'm not sure what these kids are saying, but I know this is funny and I know I want to understand it. Now, when I look back on it, having spent a lot of the last 25 years coming into and out of Russia and living in neighboring countries like Ukraine and Belarus, I get some of the jokes because comedy is really context driven, right? If you don't know the inside jokes, if you don't know the social relationships, it can be hard to translate. You can't really translate comedy. You have to adapt it. You have to make it socially appropriate and culturally appropriate, fit it in the context. One of the best things about watching a comedy movie, when you speak a few languages and you see it in subtitles, you see it's subtitled instead of dubbed, you can read the text as you watch the program, as you watch the movie, and you can see a particularly artful turn of phrase by a translator, and you can really appreciate it. That type of language knowledge comes only after years and years of practice, but it's really quite fun. I used to watch Uralskie Pelmeni back in those days. They were the team I cheered for because I had lived in the Urals, and I'm glad to see they're still around today, and they are still on fire. They're still making some great stuff. I'll tell you a quick joke about translating humor that I learned in diplomatic training, believe it or not. We had a retired ambassador, Ambassador Ed Peck. He told us a joke from his diplomatic career. He said he had an ambassador early in his career in Mauritania, his first post, who asked him to translate a joke to his Mauritanian guests to render the joke in Arabic. Now, Peck knew Arabic well, but it's hard to translate jokes, even if you know a language well. And so what Ambassador Peck did was call together the guests at the reception, and instead of translating what the ambassador's joke, word for word, he simply said to the guests, "Gentlemen, the ambassador has asked me to translate a joke." Then he let the ambassador say the next few lines, and he said, "As you can understand, it's very difficult to translate a joke. So I will tell you when the ambassador has completed the joke, and I will ask you to laugh." And his guests were very cordial and boisterously laughed when Peck told them the joke was over and they could laugh. And that is how Ambassador Peck, at that point, junior officer Ed Peck, earned the job of the ambassador's joke translator, which he maintained for the rest of his tour in Mauritania. He ended up doing that for another year or two, basically the same gig over and over again. Do I think Russians, Mia, thank you for your question. Maria, thank you for yours. Mia, do I think Russians and Americans use and treat humor and comedy differently? Yes, I think so. I think that there are universals, which is why some of the jokes, family situations, as we see in Счастливый вместе and Voroniny, are things that you can translate, you can interpret in a Russian context. I think that in general, Americans might be a little bit more optimistic than Russians, and our comedy might be a little bit brighter, and Russian comedy might be just a little bit darker. But I think in both cases, it represents societies trying to laugh even through difficulties and to overcome difficulties by laughing at them. So yeah, a little bit different, but a little bit of similarity too. Andre, a very good question. Do I think someone can learn how to be funny and how to be a comedian? Well, Andre, that's an excellent question. I would say this. I think like any skill, you can be born with it, but you need to work on it at the same time. You can be musically inclined, but that doesn't mean you don't have to spend thousands of hours practicing your violin if you want to become a virtuoso. You know, you can have comedic timing, you can be a funny guy, but if you want to be a successful writer, if you want to be a successful stand-up, if you want to be a successful comic actor, you've got to take that inborn gift and work with it to become something, to take it and make it what you can be. You can be good at football, but if you don't practice, you're never going to play for Lokomotiv. You know, that's just life, right? So I think it's a bit of nature and a bit of nurture. If you start with nothing, can you become a famous comedian? I guess. I think you probably can, depending on the genre. Maybe you could write funny texts. Maybe you won't be able to deliver them as a stand-up. Maybe you could become a writer, an author who writes comedy. Maybe that doesn't depend so much on the gift, let's say. Right? Wow, what a great question. Got lots of good ones here. We got about 10 minutes, so I'm gonna keep moving. Yulia, is American stand-up comedy that you see on TV in any way different from live stand-up shows? What do I think about Russian stand-up comedy? Yeah, stand-up that you watch on television is different from live shows, most definitely. Why? I think live shows, oftentimes comedians take their shows on the road. It's a natural form of the genre, right? It's the stand-up is made to be performed live. As comedians take a show on the road, it's almost like vaudeville, right? You go from audience to audience and you hone the set. You tell the jokes over and over again, and you work on the intonation, and you work on where you land the punchline. And ooh, that didn't go over so well. I need to rewrite it. By the time you see it on television, it's polished, right? Somebody doesn't have cameramen and producers tape a show that he's working on, that he's workshopping in front of a live audience, right? So I think the stand-up you see on TV is polished because it's a later generation of the same bits, right? The and also it's polished in another way. There are standards and practices in networks, and they will allow you to say certain things and not say other things. We'll call it censorship, but standards and practices. If you air during prime time, you're not allowed to curse. Or certain words you just don't say. That's not really true in a stand-up show. In a stand-up show, live stand-up show, pretty much all bets are off. And I've heard of famous American comedians who dealt with hecklers, people who shout out during a stand-up routine and poke fun at the comic himself by simply saying awful, terrible things in response to them, which is something which will never, ever end up on a TV show. And what do I think about Russian stand-ups? I think Russian stand-up comics, there are some really great ones. I love Urgan's monologues. I think he's fantastic. He's more of a chat show host, but he's a comic. Slepakov, I think, is terrific. Gostyan is a comic actor, very funny. So there are. I love Russian comedy. I like the classics. Sumi. I'm not a young man. Raikin, Nikulin are simply world class. They're from the Soviet past, but movies like Kavkazskaya Plenitsa, Brilliantova Ruka, simply funny. Just love them, love them, love them, love them. And Raikin's bit Avas is simply great two-man stand-up. It's good stuff. You can see that on YouTube as well. All right, let's move on. Oh, sorry. British comedians. What about Eddie Izzard? I've seen some Eddie Izzard. He's a funny guy. British humor, that's a very good example. People say of the United States and Britain that we are two countries, two peoples divided by a common language, which is a funny way of saying that really our cultures are different. And it comes out in comedy. Not all British comedians, but a lot of British comedians are a little drier, a little bit, I don't want to say esoteric, but yeah, you can tell the difference. But again, almost like when we compared Russian and American comedy, there are still things that translate. And The Office was a great example. When The Office moved to the United States, the humor got a little lighter, a little brighter. It wasn't quite as dark. There were more happy endings in the American Office than there were in the British Office. So yes, that's we share a language, but our cultures are still a little bit different. Thank you, Paulina. That was a very, very good question. In terms of British comics, there are some old stuff that's available. I mean, Monty Python is classic. Fawlty Towers is classic. A bit of Fry and Laurie from two people who've gone on to make really different things. Stephen Fry has done a lot of shows, narrated a lot of shows, written some books. Laurie went on to be the lead actor in Dr. House, the series, which wasn't funny at all, but was really great. And you can see a bit of Fry and Laurie on the internet. Diana, thank you very much for your kind words. You thanked me for an informative and interesting presentation. Have I watched Russian stand-up? And is Russian and American different? I think we touched on that. Yeah, I love Russian stand-up. I love stand-up in Russian from other countries too, including Belarus and Ukraine. Big fan of the old KVN team, 95 Kvartal. They do some really good stuff, including remakes of old Soviet movies like Sluzhebny Roman of our age, which was funny, but not as good as the original. do I agree with the position that SNL with Alec Baldwin, this is Julia's question, with Alec Baldwin as Donald Trump in some way supports him to win? No, I don't think so. I don't think comedians, the SNL team does the satire of the president. I don't think they're trying to play a role. I think they are trying to do what satirists do. Now they did have him as a guest host in 2016. And I'm sure there are some people who would have criticized them at that time for giving him access to the airwaves. But he was poking fun at himself. And that's something that presidential candidates have done in the past. Our own former ambassador, Ambassador Huntsman, when he was a presidential candidate, was a guest host of Saturday Night Live as well. So it's not the first time and not the last. Thank you for a very, very good question, Julia. Now we have Lenore. What's the ratio of conservative comedians to liberal ones? That's a very good question. I can't speak authoritatively. I think you could say that among creative types in general, you're going to find a larger proportion of liberal folks than conservative folks. I do think, however, that a lot of comedians don't necessarily want you to know their politics because they don't want to decide that 50% of American society is out of play for them. They want to tell jokes that appeal to large groups of people, right? So they might prefer to keep a little bit of that back. Some don't. Some are happy to tell you how they feel, who they support. We have a tradition of free speech, and that's certainly one that's true in comedy as well. We had comedian activists like Dick Gregory who used their stand-up to support the issues like Black civil rights. We had comedians like Pat Paulson, who during the Watergate crisis and after the Watergate crisis joked of the Nixon administration and said it was great. The average American had wonderful access to the White House. All you had to do was go to the Watergate and speak into the urinal. Of course, that was a little bit much, maybe much for me to say. A question from my colleague, Aaron Concourse. Could I comment on how understanding humor might provide a window into understanding another culture? I'm thinking of lines from comedic shows in the US that end up being quoted in slang or pop culture, like Seinfeld or The Office. That's a great question. It's a tough one. There certainly are lines that become so emblematic of a show that they get repeated. I think one that gets adapted a lot, you see in headlines here, is from Dvenata Sulyev. It says, in the morning you give me the money and in the evening I'll give you the chairs, right? And you see that adapted in different formats. There are lines from sitcoms. Some of them are a little, I don't want to say childish. The Office generated a ton of lines like that. I have my coffee here. You'll see is in a cup that's dedicated to The Office. In the show, Michael Scott bought this for himself, this very mug that said "World's Best Boss." Coffee fuels comedy. That's true, I think, everywhere in comedy writing. The question 12 is from Tanya. Why are there fewer female comedians in the US than male comedians? Well, I think that that's less and less true. I was talking about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. And back then, there may have been more men than women, but there were still some super powerful women in comedy. And I tried to bring up some of them. I think in today's stand-up, you see tons and tons of really great women, women writers, women performers. Tina Fey, biggest omission from my presentation. As soon as I sent the slides in, I said, oh, you didn't include Tina Fey. Tina Fey was head writer for Saturday Night Live. She did the show 30 Rock, which was a show basically about the process of making Saturday Night Live. She was behind the movie Mean Girls. She has written some incredibly funny monographs, books. She is one of the leading lights of American comedy today. And there are tons of really good American comedians. Samantha Bee has a great satire show. She's from Canada. Amy Poehler did a wonderful show called Parks and Recreation, which was very funny, sort of a spoof of local government in the United States. Let's see, we have a couple more questions, I think. So I think that's being addressed now. I think that you see the women's liberation movement in the 60s and 70s leading to more opportunities. You don't see careers segmented as jobs for men and jobs for women the way you once did, maybe. Now we have candidates for office at every level, men and women. We have people doing all sorts of jobs, science, mathematics. There are no barriers. Women want to do the jobs, they take the classes. One of the best stories, forgive me, the sociologist takes over here. Orchestras decided that they were going to introduce truly blind auditions for their musicians, and they allowed players to play behind a sheer curtain, and they were recognized in their performances only by numbers when they were auditioning. And the orchestras found that when they started doing that, they hired women to be brass musicians, to be trumpet players and trombone players. Whereas once upon a time, when they might have seen a woman on stage, they might have said, I don't know, it just wasn't the sound I was looking for. When they didn't know it was a woman and they were just listening to the sound, then they were willing to hire her. And now you have in many orchestras around the United States, women playing first trumpet, first trombone, tuba, other brass instruments, where once upon a time people thought that's not a thing for women. Well, surprise, it is, you know. All right, we have a note from Sander Hicks. Sander Hicks, a man who has been subjected to some of my worst jokes for many, many years because we went to high school together. Bless you, Sander, for tuning in. Gary Trudeau depicted the same scene in Doonesbury. The accessibility of the Nixon White House, I'm guessing. Yeah, that's a classic. And Doonesbury, thanks for mentioning that, Sander, is another example of a comedy genre. Doonesbury is a comic strip, right? Written for the daily newspaper in the United States and has been for many, many years. In addition to that sort of strip comedy, right? Careful there, I don't mean stripping. I mean a comic strip in a comic page, right, on a newspaper. You also have editorial cartoons, which are usually single panel, which depict an issue of the day and are another example of satire. The editorial cartoonist Thomas Nast did send-ups of both the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's how they got their animal symbols. The elephant for the Republican Party and the donkey for the Democratic Party. So that's something that stuck from the moved from satire into the mainstream. Sorry, I'm scrolling down to see what more questions we have. Are there more slapstick or sight gags in American comedy versus Russian comedy? Jane. Jane, thank you very much. For a good question. Slapstick, yeah, slapstick's present in American comedy. I wouldn't want to say it's not present in Russian comedy. I think it is. But is it more or less? I think you'd have to have a better handle on the breadth and depth of Russian comedy to answer that one fairly. We like the silly stuff, maybe just a little bit more, though. It would be my guess. And honest men and women may differ on this. The next question from Julia. Does American oral humor have an aspect? Whoop, I just popped off the screen. Hold on a second. Nature for the Black American community. You know, the African Americans have been successful comics in the United States for a century and more. Before the Black Civil Rights Movement, a lot of them performed to segregated audiences. One of the great African American comics of the old days was Red Fox. Red Fox, in addition to performing stand-up, was the lead in a show called Sanford and Son, which was an adaptation itself of a British comedy. Red Fox, extremely funny man. Sometimes they have a cadence which is different. Sometimes they don't. A lot of African American comics are completely mainstream. Some do more observational humor based on their own African American experience, and that might be geared toward an African American audience. But very many of them simply sometimes talk about their own experience, but talk about it for a broader audience. I think it's really interesting that Black comedians have really dominated modern American comedy in important ways. Eddie Murphy, Saturday Night Live, Dave Chappelle, Chappelle Show, Kian Peele. They weren't our leading Black comedians, they were our leading comedians, right? When their shows were hot, they were the business. Everything was about them, right? So I think that shows sort of how far we've come. Okay. Sandra corrects me. It was the ambassador joke that was done in Doonesbury. Very well. I would just say that Peck is so old that he must have told that joke first. I have a question here from Katerina. Do I know or like Chvanetsky? Don't know him, need to look up his stuff. Thanks, Katerina, for that tip. And Tanya Nazarova thanks me for a great meeting that was interesting and informative. Thank you very much. That's a wonderful, to everyone for the wonderful questions. They were fantastic. If we could go back to my slides for just 1 second, I want to show you my final slide, which is simply another thank you. I want to say, let's keep in touch. This has been really fun. If this is a topic that's interesting to you, if you have a question I didn't get to, reach out to me via email. Email's on the screen, krishoklj@state.gov. Or you can follow me on Facebook. You can just Google Facebook @Lou in Vladivostok, and you will see my page on Facebook, and I'd love to keep in touch. This was really, really fun for me, ladies and gentlemen. I can't thank you enough for taking the time and making the effort to be with us today, to give me the opportunity to share this with you. It's been a lot of fun, and I hope that we can talk about this again sometime soon. Thank you very much, and good night.